So if you're going to, I think this is one of the great things about this conference is that people are going face to face, meeting each other, and you would be surprised what that means. I just wanted to make one comment about the last panel, which I thought was superb. I think sometimes in politics, I'm sure I've been as guilty of this as anybody else and readily admit it, is we too often use the machete and we forget about the scalpel. And the best example of the scalpel that I know is one of my favorite politicians ever, honestly, was Burl Long, who was the governor of Louisiana, and he was running for re-election. And a guy by the name of Fred Preuss, who was a Ford dealer in Farmerville, Louisiana, which is a town of about 3,500 people, almost on the Arkansas border, was running against him. And of course, the argument was that Earl was corrupt, and he made, and that he'd been in power for too long, and that he'd sort of forgotten his roots, et cetera, et cetera. And Fred Preuss was an honest guy, but it was a Ford dealer from Farmerville, and Earl said, I want to say this about my opponent, about Fred Preuss. He is a really honest guy. He's a deacon of the First Baptist Church. He's in the Rotary Club. And if I had to buy a Ford, I want you to know that I would buy that Ford from Fred Preuss because, first of all, he's the kind of guy that's going to give you a good deal. And if something happens to your car, you take it in, he's going to fix it for you. He's going to give you a loaner, let you use that, and you come back and you get it. And that's just the kind of guy that Fred is. He said, now, if I had to buy two Fords, of course, I'd have to go somewhere else because he's not big enough to handle a deal. Implicit on that, I think that's sort of more effective about some omnibus, is Fred Preuss qualified to handle the job of governor of Louisiana, and in that is, I think, a lesson that sometimes the scalpel can be very effective. Now, this next panel, and I'm going to introduce the moderator of it and let him go through it. If I say this in all sincerity, if you ask people, name the three best political journalists of the last 20 years, I'm not going to be stupid enough to say who's number one, but I'm going to say that there is no list that Ronald Brownstein would not be on, period. And not just in terms of reports, but in terms of analysis. He's one of these people that people pay attention to for a justifiable reason. He generally has something to say, and more often than not, it's remarkably profound. I did everything I could to get him in my Tulane class. Hopefully we can get him back at some other point. But that he's down here in New Orleans and leading this panel is remarkable. He's a truly remarkable guy who has remarkable insights, and I'm going to let him introduce this panel. And if you look through your book, and as he does, notice who these people are. And I also just want to emphasize that these people have worked not just in campaigns, but are very influential throughout Washington. Having said that, I'm going to have to excuse myself so I can get ready for the next social event, which, as we know, in New Orleans is just as important as sort of work. But I appreciate it. Ron, take it over, please.
Thank you, James. And thank you for those very kind words coming, especially from you. Although I would say, for a reporter known to be perceptive, it seems that I'm the one who did not get the memo that the journalist is the only one in the panel wearing a tie. I find that we're supposed to be the ink-stained wretches. But you folks have a treat here because you have some of the really the best minds in American politics, in American campaigns here. And like Walter, I will note that the bios are all in the program, but we should just quickly introduce from my left and then moving across Larry Grisolano, a longtime Democratic veteran who served as Director of Paid Media and Opinion Research for the Obama campaign. John Anzalone, a pollster who specializes in electing Democrats in difficult places where they don't often elect Democrats. Stan Greenberg, who I have known for as long as I have been covering politics, who's a Democratic pollster whose clients have included Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Tony Blair, and Nelson Mandela. Pretty good list. On his side, Bill McInturff, a Republican pollster who I've also known for just about as long as I've been covering politics, whose firm, POS, represents, it seems, just about every Republican elected official, but I'm told in the program 19 senators, 7 governors, 40 House members, and of course were the lead pollsters for John McCain in 2008. The rakish gentleman to his left, Mark McKinnon, who is, in addition to being an expert on all things music, is a media consultant whose clients have included John McCain, George W. Bush, and Ann Richards. I'm sure there's no one else who can say that. And finally, Alex Castellanos, who has been a consultant to, 7 Republican presidential campaigns, and now is often found going toe-to-toe with assorted analysts of all political stripes on CNN, and can tell us what Anderson Cooper is really like. We want to do 2 things here this afternoon. We want to talk about the first year of this very eventful and even tumultuous Obama presidency, with a special focus on the questions that we're here to discuss today, which is taking the poison out of partisanship and the extent to which he has and has not been able to reverse the trends toward greater ideological and partisan conflict. But let me start really with kind of the broadest question. I suppose if we were going to do a ledger here, we're about 1 year after the election at this point, you might look at the Obama presidency and say, he has maintained an approval rating at 50% or above amid very hard economic times. He has averted, it appears, a full-scale collapse of the economy that some people feared. He is continuing to pass legislation, the health care bill, the first president in 100 years in either party to get a universal or something approaching universal care bill to the floor. And he has held Democrats together in Congress to a greater extent than Clinton did, and polling shows that he has improved America's image in the world. On the other side of the ledger, we would say unemployment has now crested past 10%, perhaps not even crested. The Republican base is clearly energized after being somewhat dispirited at the end of the Bush presidency. Independents are expressing in polling increasing anxiety about the scale and cost and scope of the agenda, and some of those concerns seem to have been validated in the way they voted on Tuesday in New Jersey and Virginia. And while America's image in the world has improved, some of the problems that we face, whether it's Iran or Afghanistan, seem to be as intractable as ever. So I think if you add all that up and whatever else you want to throw in, is the elevator going up or down at this point? I mean, is this a presidency that is gaining strength or is losing momentum? And Stan, if you don't mind, I'll start with you and put you on the spot. Which direction is it heading right now for President Obama?
Yeah, I don't think the metaphor is right. I mean, if I look at the president's. By the way, thank you for this. Thank you for the organizers, for doing this. The last time I did this, my wife is a member of Congress. Was a bipartisan retreat in Gettysburg, and my partner was Bob Barr, who then left that retreat and went and filed his petition to impeach Bill Clinton. And then my wife got attacked for going to this boondoggle in Gettysburg. So bipartisanship is not in my blood. But on the question of whether the elevator is going up or down, if you look at Bill Clinton, that elevator went up and down, many times. It was more a roller coaster, and I think that's a more like metaphor. Though we've not had President Obama has not had the kinds of swings in either approval or his personal favorability that Bill Clinton did, but for sure, as we, I think the comparable battle for us was passing the economic plan. Our approval was going down into that process. Once he passed his budget, which was a tax increase and deficit reduction, his approval went up, significantly. It was sustained over many months as he proceeded then to launch a number of initiatives. But then, Troopergate, crash, failure, health care. And so I just think it's very hard to tell where we are in the story. All the things you say are true. That is, all the positives, all the negatives are true. The intensity, and I'm not even sure 2010 is the right point in which we're going to see this played out, because you can have a 1982 election in which Democrats made gains, but when that story really played out, it was 1984, which was both a landslide and realigning, which I still think is possible in the scenario through to 2012. So I think it's too early to tell.
Bill?
Well, I think from a polling perspective, you have to look at the two Obamas, which is the personal ratings and how people feel about his job performance. I do the polling with Democrat pollster Peter Hart. We have a sequence on a 1 to 5 scale. How well does this describe Obama? 4 or 5 are positive numbers. we did a series of 12 or 14 attributes in March that we repeated a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. And so what Peter did was interesting. He took those attributes and split them between personal ratings about him personally and then job things that had to do with his job. And so his personal ratings, he averaged a 61%, 4 or 5 ratings, and the job ratings he averaged 41. There was about a 20-point difference. And although both ratings had slipped, he had really declined on the job ratings. And so what my sense is this is a country that, as I said in January, given our problems, had a long rope for the president. They wanted this president to be successful. They want a successful presidency. They like him personally. But I think there are really growing concerns and doubts, and I think those are exacerbated certainly by economic tension. Number two, there's a really good question. I wish I wrote it, CNN did instead, and it was thinking a year from now, if the economy is not better, who do you blame? Bush and Republicans or Obama and Democrats? The question we do for NBC is just now. I like this idea of like if it doesn't get better in a year, who do you blame? In March, by 24 points, they said they blamed Bush. Today, that number was tied. And the history of Ronald Reagan is that by next June or July, you've inherited the economy. These are your ideas. And so I think that the other thing I caution my party about, I think we're going to be turning into and that's tomorrow's conversation, we're going to have a very good 2010. But I think just like 1982 and 1994, a really good 2010 doesn't mean very much for 2012. My other quick note is I think there's about a 1 in 4 chance that he'll have a Carter-like presidency, and there's a 1 in 4 chance still, I believe, that he will have a transformational presidency. Because, again, you look at John Engler, a Republican governor from Michigan, you look at Mitch Daniels. We've had Republican governors who've taken over in tough times, and they've done very difficult things, and they had really lousy numbers, and their job approval dropped. They had really lousy numbers, and people woke up 4 years later and said, oh, my God, we did a lot of big things, and he changed the state, and their numbers go up really sharply. And so that's the 1 in 4 chance that we could be seeing with Obama. I mean, there's a drop to come, but it could be a positive, consequential presidency, as well as, I think we could be looking at Jimmy Carter, which is an ineffectual presidency combined with very, very wrong track policies. And I think that's a 1 in 4 chance.
Larry, did you want?
I feel as though I'm a little bit on the stage with some freaks of nature, because it's nice to be with pollsters who can see beyond the moment and look forward to where the trajectory of things might be going. I think that right now what the president is very consistent with the analysis here. What the president is benefiting from is a sense of people that he's in a very tough set of circumstances. He took over at a tough time, and he's sort of doing a commendable job of calling them like he sees them. He makes reasoned choices. He thinks hard about things, and he tries to do the right thing. He's not sort of ideology bound or partisanship bound so much as he's got a bunch of fastballs coming his way, and he's doing his best to call the balls and strikes accurately. I do think that there will come, and at the moment I think that's sufficient for people. I do think there will come a moment where people begin to change the criteria and start saying, well, what is this all yielding? I think voters at this moment are somewhat patient, in part because I think they're looking across the landscape and they don't see a lot of alternatives. They're not ready to sort of kind of cast their lot with the leadership of Congress in either party or some alternative leader out there, and this is the guy they've got, and they're relatively satisfied by that. I think they also find a level of personal assurance in his style. He seems like he's on top of things. He's genuine and sincere and smart, and I think that at a time when there's a high level of anxiety, there's a personal style there that's suiting their needs. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to have to see at the moment at which people start saying enough of that. Now I demand results, and that's the sole criteria. If things have been able to turn around at that moment, that's I think what's on the horizon.
Alex, do you?
Thank you for having us here today. I think the elevator is going down, but they do tend to go back up eventually. I think it's going down because Barack Obama is doing so many things that you can't really see the story of any particular one of them. All you see is the common denominator, and that has been spending and debt. And that has scared some people. It scared independents. And I think to some degree he has debranded the Democratic Party as a party of economic responsibility, which we as Republicans made them. And so he's moved away from that. And I think that means that they're going to lose a bunch of seats in the 2010 election. I think it could be a whole lot of seats. I think it could be 40 seats. And this is a big wave. It's going to be a big brake pedal election. You know, the car's teetering on the edge of the cliff here, going pretty fast. And if you're a voter, the only way you're empowered is by saying, slow down, tap the brake pedal. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that. But the good news for Obama is I think he's going to be defeated for re-election in 2010 when he's not on the ballot. Mm-hmm. And so he'll have 2 years after that to say the era of big government is over again and move to, I think, a more deficit reduction agenda. And people do want him to succeed. His numbers personally are better. You know, he represents a better America than we used to be. Nobody wants to reject him and go back to him. So he's going to get a second win. And that's why it's incumbent on Republicans. All he's given Republicans is an opportunity, not a victory.
John, they're going to be addressing some of this tomorrow, but you represent candidates often at the front line of that. Is Alex right? Could the wave, is Obama setting in motion conditions that will threaten Democrats at the kind of the frontier of their majority?
Well, a couple things that I think we have to put in perspective. First of all, the Republican branding is at a new time low. We're talking about Obama. His job rating is still a little bit above 50%. Interestingly enough, it's right where Ronald Reagan's was at this time, except the unemployment rate is 25% higher. The foreclosure rate is literally almost not quite double. The consumer index is worse. And so things, tend to be relative. But when you take a look at a couple key factors, why I think that the elevator is going up, actually, he's kind of breaking the rules. I mean, he kind of runs up the steps. He doesn't wait for the elevator. And really, think about it, that voters tend to reward presidents who do big and bold things. Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and I think they'll reward Obama. It just takes some time, to take some patience. Those who were a little bit complacent, or at least the perceptions were that they weren't getting anything done, Carter, George Bush, they were penalized. But to get back to, it's all about the competition. Regardless of where Obama is right now, only 20% of Americans feel or self-ID as Republicans. When you ask another question, for example, about who do you trust, the number of Obama to Republicans is not quite 2 to 1. It depending on the measure. The other thing is that when you ask, do you think Obama is trying to work with Republicans, about 60% say yes. But when you ask, are Republicans trying to work with Obama, it's almost 60% no. And you see another important indicator going to the 2010 elections is that the generic ballot, that very simple question, are you more likely to vote for a Democrat or a Republican, is still a net positive, and it depends on who you look at.
Net positive for Democrats.
Net positive for Democrats, and literally not quite by double digits, but high single digits at this point in time. And I think that, again, the comparison to the bad political branding for Republicans, who people trust about getting things done, and the generic ballot is indicators that those prognosticators about this huge wave in 2010 is way too premature at this point in time, and it's hopeful thinking on their part.
I want to come back to the conflict point in a moment, but Mark, Alex said there's no storyline here. I mean, that it's being lost in the Obama presidency. They're not kind of giving a coherent narrative to the country. What's your take of where he is in terms of identifying himself and his policies?
Well, there's another point he made that I want to touch on, which is that President Obama is getting a great deal of latitude from American voters, which I don't think anybody else would have received for all the obvious and historical reasons. And I was a big John McCain supporter and voted for him, although I liked Obama and stepped out for the general election because I didn't want to be part of a campaign that was attacking him. So I'm kind of a radical centrist who finds myself on the right side of the line. But I want him to succeed. I'm not a Republican Obama hater, and But I think about John McCain if he were president, or Hillary Clinton, and I think things would have really, if you kind of walk that through, they just wouldn't have had the latitude that President Obama has had. And I think that he's dealt with big problems that would have been difficult for anybody. But we have such a short memory, and I remember clearly when during the worst part of the economic collapse, where I was thinking about, okay, now how do I get a bomb shelter? Where do I get spam? Where do I buy guns? You know, I mean, it was really dark, and we have very short memories. And, you know, thanks to a lot of things that my former boss, George Bush, did, and tough decisions that President Obama made, stock market's up to a couple hundred points today. And, you know, sure, that hasn't translated into jobs yet. But, you know, we're a functioning society, which, you know, 10 months ago, it was a little questionable. So, you know, where it is I think the elevator's sort of stuck in the middle, but he's going to get the benefit of the doubt for a while, but not much longer. He's going to have to start owning it, stop talking about the mop and what he inherited, and man up to own what he's got and what he's going to do. People want that from their leadership. But the other thing that I'll say is, and the fun thing about politics for all of us in the game, is that the conventional wisdom is so often wrong. And this game is so unpredictable and fascinating. And I remember 1992 when George H.W. Bush, or 91, whenever it was, had approval ratings of 90 out of the Gulf War. And that's at a time when Lloyd Bentsen and the big lines of the Democratic Party decided not to run because George H.W. Bush was so popular and took a pass, and that created an opening for this Southern governor named Bill Clinton. So people who tell me that Obama is an automatic for re-elect, I remind them about how rapidly this landscape can change.
One aspect of the presidency that has unfolded perhaps not the way he wanted is the level of conflict we continue to see in Washington, and also, for that matter, in the public reaction to him. I mean, he was introduced to the country in 2004 in his initial speech as someone who would transcend boundaries of red and blue, ideological boundaries, cultural boundaries, racial boundaries. And yet here we are, a health care bill this weekend, one Republican voted for, no House Republicans voted for the stimulus, only 3 in the Senate. Today, David Winston and I were looking at today, the latest weekly average in the Gallup poll, a 68-point gap between his approval among Democrats and Republicans. And I think by any measure, we still have a very polarized, partisan debate in Washington. How come? Why has that not changed more? Is it Obama? Is it the Republicans? Is it forces bigger than both of them? And Mark, maybe I'll just start with you, since even though you just finished, because you're someone who's kind of worked on both sides of this. When you look at this now, why hasn't the chasm narrowed more than it has?
Well, I think it's an extension of the discussion we're having on the earlier panel. There are just so many mechanisms in place now. Redistricting, cable television, everything is driving the political debate and the culture to the extremes. And there's no reward anymore for being in the middle. I mean, all the incentive and the reward is for being the loudest, for being the most partisan. And so we've got to find a way within the system in terms of this discussion about bipartisan. Of course, we can have our differences, but I think that we have to find ways to penalize the political class for behavior that's unacceptable or politics that are unacceptable. And unfortunately, the only way that that's really done is in the marketplace of voting. And so we have to figure out how to translate that into voting behavior.
Stanley, you want to?
Let me make what will sound like a partisan comment. It's a partisan analysis. But I challenge my Republican friends because I think they share it. I just don't know whether we can, have that kind of frank discussion. What's driving this is the politics of the Republican Party more than anything. 60% of Democrats are self-described moderates and conservatives. 40% of Democrats are liberals. The predominance of the Democratic Party are indeed people who are trying to run for the center. If you look at the voting record of members of Congress over the last decade, the Democratic members have tended toward mainstream opinion and attitudes. It has been polarized mainly on the Republican side. We did a study we released a few weeks ago about the self-identified Republicans who vote straight Republican. They're overwhelmingly conservative Republicans, but they are, as you know, conservative Republicans are twice as moderate, but more than that, 2.5 to 1. Conservative Republicans. They view the president as an immense threat to the country, very intense in their views. And part of what's driving this is that kind of process on the Republican side. If you look at the specifics of the policies, there are two things. One, look at civil society. Okay? I was looking at the response to the health care bill. I was looking at the Restaurant Association. And they had supported some provision in the thing. And then there was a little sentence that said, by the way, they were intense opponents of President Clinton's health care plan, but they were taking no position on the health care bill. The health care plan is supported by Walmart, by, not the Chamber of Commerce, but it's supported by the AMA, all these sectors that civil society is bipartisan. Okay, what's happening is politics have become separated from society, which is actually, same thing on energy. Cap and trade is a market-oriented concept. Center-right parties, center-left parties everywhere go there. Utilities, many businesses want to go to market solutions on those issues. The health care bill is an individual mandate. That is a Republican idea. For years, Republicans have been for those ideas that are being addressed in policy. I want to argue that advance that as Republicans have become more homogeneous, more Southern, that the internal politics has made it harder and harder to have a bipartisan politics, even as the groups outside and even as the policy becomes more moderate.
Alex.
Perhaps a slightly different view. Look, there's certainly a cranky dark core in the Republican Party. However, this nation, unlike others, is founded on an idea, and that you don't tell people what to do. You're free to live your own life. And that is an idea that a lot of Republicans feel passionately about in an era when more power is growing to the state to tell people what to do. So yes, that's something Republicans are passionate about, but we've just seen candidates who believe that win the center and win independence, because there's a great hunk of this country now that's concerned that a lot of smart people at the top who don't understand their lives are taking all their money and resources and coming up with lots of plans, policies, and schemes to run their lives when they'd rather come up with their own plans and dreams and hopes and have money to invest in those. So I think there are things worth fighting for, and I don't think that in an effort for bipartisanship, we should necessarily say it requires you to reject your base and compromise your beliefs. I think Obama's problem, actually, the reason we're in a partisan environment now is because the president's been successful. He got too lucky. He won the House and the Senate, and he has one-party rule. And to keep his party together, he has to play not to Republicans. He has to keep his party together, and so he's moved farther to the left.
Let me though follow up.
That's why we're in he has put bipartisanship, I think, out of reach to some degree, just because there's nothing more dangerous in politics and life than success.
Do you want to say something, Stan? Bill, I want to follow up with you, though, on Stan's point, because you have done a lot, particularly in the healthcare field. And I think, as someone who has been in there for a long time, it is remarkable to see the AMA supporting a healthcare reform. They have opposed everyone since the 19-teens, literally. And pharma at large points of this has been supporting, and other groups that traditionally have opposed. And yet, and as Stan said, also like on the energy side, where you have the Edison Electric Institute, which is the utilities, supporting cap and trade, as well as a number of individual businesses, that has not translated into any support. I asked Billy Tozan a couple weeks ago, as the head of pharma, the former congressman from around here. The drug industry has given $120 million to federal candidates since 1990, two-thirds of it to Republicans, and yet they could not, deliver a single Republican to support health care. What does explain the disconnect between elements of the business community that are willing to support the direction Obama is going and the fact that it is virtually uniform opposition even among the Republicans in Congress while that is occurring?
60 votes in the Senate and 80-seat margins in the House. I think that let's just talk as pollsters, and just give some friends. No, but I just say, look, here's what's important. When you ask people, is the stimulus a good idea or a bad idea? It was $787 billion. There were lots of Republican ideas that were actually pretty good policy, I thought, that would spend the money quicker, do more to create immediate jobs, that were ignored. And then in late March, they bought General Motors and Chrysler. And so what happened is back to back in a 30-day period, a lot of people said, oh my God, another $1 trillion. And for a lot of Americans, they woke up and said, what? The American government owns General Motors and Chrysler? That's not the America I know. American governments don't own big companies in America. And so what ruptured? What ruptured is this concern that there is way too much big spending. And to be fair, it's not the president's fault, but when you say to people in focus groups, what's the stimulus? They combine $787 billion, the billions and billions and billions for the big banks, the clunker program. There's just this one huge massive spending called the, that's the stimulus package. And look, the president, we have 14% of our economy. That's the percent of our debt this year to the overall gross domestic product. And in 10 years, their own budgets say it's going to be at World War II level, 70%. Of our economy is going to be the percent of our debt to the gross domestic product. So it's rational to say, gee, that's kind of out of control. And two, when they bought, and I think it's a huge, with so much consequences happen, the fact that we bought those companies is a big deal. So guess what happened? A lot of swing voters and a lot of people said, oh my God, we're spending way too much money and this is too much government. And what happens in off-year elections? It's as Alex said, it is, and Republican Party's got lots of troubles. A mid-year election is to put on the brake, let me send them a signal, that was too far. So, but what happened in health care is 80 vote margins in the House and 60 votes in the Senate. So a lot of private folks said, oh my God, there's going to be a bill, and we're better off negotiating in good faith and trying to get our legislative solution because there's going to be a bill. And, what's going to happen is there is still this possibility, which is the AMA is there because they thought they were going to get a permanent fix for a 10-year deal on Medicare reimbursement rates to doctors. That hasn't gotten fixed yet. If it doesn't get fixed before a final vote, I don't know where the AMA is going to be. The hospitals are there because the hospitals were told they're going to have 96% coverage. If the bill gets diluted because the mandate goes down and other stuff happens and it gets a 92% coverage, they can't afford it.
Go back, though, to the point, though. Why do you think that industry support did not translate into any Republican support?
Because, look, we're down to 170 votes. We lost 54 seats in 2 years. At 177 votes, this poor gentleman in New Orleans, okay, we could lose that seat. Okay, the guy's in a 75% Obama district. But candidly, I'm sorry, at 177 seats, there are not a hell of a lot of seats that you can lose. Okay? You just look around the country and say, we're going to lose all of those seats? No. 1, 2, 3, maybe, we're going to lose 3 or 4 of those seats because we've lost everything. There's a certain freedom of have nothing left.
John, yeah, right.
Self-preservation is the answer. Yeah. Listen, does anyone know anything about the Republican health care bill? Deafening silence. The reality is this, is that if I was a Republican consultant, I would be concerned because they're becoming the party of no ideas, and they used to be a party of ideas. Whether you liked them or not, Gingrich always had ideas, right? He always had, thoughtful ideas. And the reality is that the Republicans have said it's better to kill this and demonize Obama than to come up, with bipartisanship. And again, I reiterate these numbers that are still hold today, that 63% believe that Obama has tried to work with Republicans, and 60% believe that Republicans have not tried to work with Obama. And so I think that you've got to come to the table with ideas. And I think at the end of the day, people are prophesizing this big loss for Democrats, not understanding that we have the possibility of some big wins on health care and cap and trade and financial regulation and maybe some other transportation. And they may not all be perfect, but people love action. Okay, and it's a tough time, and we're going to be rewarded for that. And I, as a consultant, actually look forward to the campaign when I'm able to say the AMA, the AARP, Walmart,
Catholic
Target,
bishops.
The Catholic bishops. I can go on. And then on an island are the Republicans with the insurance industry. That is a contrast and a debate I am willing to take on, even though right now it looks pretty dire for some of those people who voted for health care.
I'm just saying, guess what? That might not be the campaign you run because the deals that were put in place to have that, what you just described, are still a long, long, long way away from the final bill.
I want to come back to that in a second.
And I do think, and the other thing I'm saying is that in the short term in 2010. And that's what look, my former wife said my most disgusting habit was quoting myself in my TV appearances. But I'm divorced, so, I can go for it now. She's gone. I can go on with my bad habits. So,
well, you got off easy.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let me quote myself from my Sunday appearance in CNN, which is the health care bill was that rare thing where both parties believe it's going to be to their political benefit.
We'll come back to that.
I just echo what Bill was implying, which is, John, you may be right in the long term, but in the short term for 2010, I think a political success on the health care may be a liability for 2010. It'll be so big, so new, won't have had time to work, and I think a lot of those independent voters are out there will be.
Let me come back to that, but let me ask you this. Your own analysis, but also you have a lot of friends in the White House, their analysis of why we continue to see the level of polarization both in Congress and, for that matter, as I said, in the public opinion polling. Why it's so difficult to get Republican votes in Congress, so hard to maintain any kind of approval rating among Republican partisans.
Republicans aren't going to be for trillions of new spending and buying companies.
All right, hold on. I asked Larry.
That's what we believe in. We don't believe in that stuff.
What's the assessment?
First of all, I'm not speaking for
Right. Your own assessment, then.
It's off the record.
I mean, it is. I think that at a very fundamental level, what's being said, and Alex, about these heartfelt beliefs of Republicans, I think to a great degree there are differences in ideas. Senator Blinovich, however, said, look, a lot of this is just Republicans not wanting to let this guy win. Pure, bald, naked politics. How do you change that? You're not going to change that. However, you can do some things to basically try your best to create an atmosphere of bipartisanship. There was the speculation that there was sort of a partisan strategy in Congress behind how health care was going to be passed. It couldn't be farther from the truth. The early discussions of this it was almost unthinkable that it would go through with only Democratic votes. It was, how do you craft a compromise that is going to bring everybody in? In fact, there continues to be an assiduous process of trying to have all the players at the table, not to repeat the Clinton mistake of shutting people out, and that continues to this day. So, and at the congressional level, by the way, Senator Baucus in the Finance Committee, to his credit on the point of bipartisanship, was nearly obsessed with trying to court Republicans, and not Senator Snowe and Senator Collins, but people like Senator Grassley. And so you basically have to do your best to kind of find ways to meet in the middle, and you got to do your best to try and find a meeting of the minds. But at the end of the day, it does take two to tango. And if it is, as Senator Voinovich said, just simply an exercise in trying to score political points and not let Obama get a victory, for him it was more important to cover people and to bring down health care costs, and that's going to march on in spite of political
Let me ask you about some of the structural questions here that may be beyond the individual motivations of Obama or an individual senator. I mean, the reality is, when a president has an approval rating of 15% among the partisans of one party, it is not easy to ask a senator of that party to stand with him, to cross party lines on a big issue. And that was true under Bush, as Bush experienced on Social Security, when they hoped to bring those red state Democrats along. Mark, we talked about this at the time, and yet Bush was so unpopular with rank-and-file Democrats, whether you were Ben Nelson or Ken Conrad or whoever, you had to think twice. Now, Obama's at 14% among Republicans, and even if you are inclined to work with him, you know that that's going to produce a lot of grief. So I guess I'm asking, which is the chicken and which is the egg here? I mean, each president's approval rating among voters in the opposite party is declining faster with each succeeding president. Does that by itself almost make it impossible to get big support from members of the other party on big things? Or is it the lack of support of members of the other party that drives down the approval rating? Which way does it go? Bill, you want to?
What I'm saying is, again, and this, because again, I would say to Stan did a very interesting and very well-written, kind of write-up about the conservative Republican base, and it was being out of step with America. And I kind of wanted to say, Stan, why don't we look at the core Democrat primary voters? They're not exactly in the heartbeat of a middle America. And my point, Stan, is, look, political parties have core beliefs. They're allowed to have core beliefs. That's what divides the party. And guess what? Although we have a large chunk of middle Americans said, oh, both parties are the same, they're really not. And the people, the men and women who serve in the House and Senate are pretty strong ideologues. And ideology is not a bad thing. And we have battles in the country to come to resolution around ideological differences. But at 40 votes in the Senate and 177 in the House, those people that have survived the last two cycles are the people who feel most strongly about the spending, size of government, and stuff that we're not going to vote for these bills. And my point is, and Senator Snow's a good example. She's my client. She has a terrific sense of where is the center in Maine. What is it that has allowed her to be elected in a very difficult, precarious state since 1978? And what was her balance? It was, I'm going to vote for the bill, but I can't vote for a public option. Because, again, for those 177 members on our side, or I guess 176, although, by the way, that Republican vote came after 218. Yeah. It was very clear he was sitting with our leadership because he wasn't going to be the 218 vote. But my point is Senator Snow came to this calculation that for lots and lots and lots of people, the public option is the thing that means that it is the entree to too much government and health care, which is not acceptable to what we think should happen. And, by the way, Massachusetts Republican Governor Romney passed an individual mandate, and he demonstrates you don't have to get to coverage through public option. You can do that through private coverage and a mandate.
I'm going to go to the audience. I'm going to go to the audience in a minute, but I want to maybe just ask does anyone on the panel think it is possible in this era with the media and everything else that's going on for a president to maintain a robust approval rating among voters in the opposite party? Maybe not even 50, but something close to it. Or is that just a thing of the past?
I think we could have. Does this work? Oh,
yeah, it does.
I've been told my other microphone doesn't want you to listen to me, so, you know.
We arranged that earlier.
Yeah. Thank you. I can see why. I think it's possible even for this president now to be popular among
Republicans.
But Republicans, it takes no more than to be popular among independents. I think, there's a fundamental. The Obama who talked about pay-as-you-go budgeting during the campaign and how he supported that, if that one came back, he'd score points. If Barack Obama today said, by the way, my girls go to the best school in Washington, I think every American ought to have equal opportunity to send their kids to the best schools, whatever they choose. He would find Republican support, and he would cut across on the values.
Let me ask you a question about that, because no matter what a president does, no matter how much he reaches out to the other side, there now exists a transmission belt in the media on each side, but say on the Republican side of, certain shows on Fox, Rush Limbaugh, blogs, and the odds are they would not be talking about that outreach part of it. They'd be talking about the elements of his agenda that most antagonize the base. I mean, even if Obama became pro-voucher, I'm guessing Limbaugh would find something other in his education agenda to talk about every day. So I kind of wonder, with this dedicated transmission belt right to the base of each party, whether every president is now doomed to be at 20% on the other side very quickly, and thus creating an environment in which it's very hard for elected officials from that other party to be with him.
You got to remember, here's the big problem, is that the Republican Party has shrunk to 20% self-ID. You can almost fit them on a Carnival cruise ship. I mean, it's just, and so the core is so small now that it is almost unrealistic for Obama's numbers to go up with that. And here's the other interesting thing among the pollsters here, is that
this is the party that did happen to win an election or two
right
all across the nation Tuesday. So
and that's
the 20% figure is.
I understand. Well, no, it's real. It's real. But
we have potential.
The whole news story was it was independents.
Yeah.
It wasn't the Republican.
Interestingly enough, the independents, we like to, right now here in November, the pundits like to say, okay, Obama was here with independents, and now he's really bad. True, his numbers have gone bad. Guess what? When you have your self-party ID go from 30 to 20, where do they go? They become independents. Independents are is Republican-dominated now. Now, that doesn't mean anything that you're not doing bad with them, but we have to remember that it's being dominated.
Maybe a quick comment from Stan and Mark, and then we'll go to the audience. And I have a final question for these guys.
I had a problem with the metaphor and the elevators. I think I have a problem with these each party for the same reasons that are being talked about. It's the independents that matter here and need to drive it. If you look at the last two elections, Democrats have been double digits amongst independents. It is true that 60% of Democrats are moderates and conservatives. The people we've elected have come out of more affluent suburbs, rural areas. The new people that are elected in the last two elections is a diverse party. we're not going to succeed, hold on to those majorities, that electoral college, unless we are appealing to that. President Obama has a very strong political incentive to be speaking to those independents, to be to buttressing his moderate and conservative majority in the country. That changes the dynamic on the Democratic side. It's a very different dynamic on the Republican side.
Yeah, but that all. I'm sorry. I know, Ron, you want to wrap up, but first. Just two quick things. The Washington Post is 20%, so that number does exist. But those are adult surveys. And what I tell people is that's a very good predictor when 93% of Americans vote in November 2010 because they'll get fined for not voting. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Australia. What's going to happen in 2010 is about 1 out of 3 people vote. And when you get to the electorate for 2010, you look at what Stan's doing for NPR with my partner and others, that what's happening is that the generic vote's not like high single digits. It's very, very close. And the pool of people who chose to vote in 2009 were radically different in New Jersey and Virginia in ways very concerning the Democrats. And the intensity. The intensity of the people who want to send the go slow, hit the brake sign right now is very strong, and that's what happens in off years. So tomorrow when we're here, we got tremendous problems for 2012. That's a different conversation. But my point is, and what I'm saying is, I think it's fair to say that if you look at what the president's proposed in spending and projected deficits and buying General Motors and the other and health care and by the reinsertion of the public option, that it is not surprising that he is running into opposition, and you can't expect Republicans to say, I agree with that agenda. Now, by the way, I think my party's been tone deaf because I think the president deserves credit for not releasing the photos from Iraq, for what he's done to this long consideration for Afghanistan, where I think he will increase troops. I think he's done good stuff on charter schools and others where this challenge money. And a smarter Republican Party would get up every frigging day and say, I agree with the president. Those are good initiatives.
We have people with microphones. I'm going to see if we want to go to the first question with Mark while they're doing that. Why don't you add a final thought?
To answer your question, Ron, I do think it's possible. I think it's very difficult today. But I think if you look historically, quite often great leaders are defined by people who are willing to make tough and unpopular decisions. Presidents and leaders who are trying to win popularity contests are generally not well judged by history. And so I think it's certainly possible that Obama could get a share of support among independents and Republicans, but it will require probably stepping on the toes of some of his core constituency on big issues like Afghanistan. Now, I'm really, a lot of us are, we're all watching that decision very closely, but I like the way it's headed, and I think he's going to make the right decision. I think it's going to be a tough decision for him. I think it's going to be cross-pressured heavily on his left. But I think he'll gain a measure of respect and support from Republicans by making that decision.
And on domestic issues, though, do you think it is going to be possible for Republicans?
On the education issues that he means going up against the labor unions on some of this education stuff.
Okay.
So that's
let's go to our first question.
I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and in the spring I went as part of our national organization to lobby Congress. And Louisiana has 3 congressmen who are physicians. They are Republican. And when we went to meet with them, they said, in April, we will not be a part of that discussion. Don't bother talking to us about health care. So I was really disappointed that we were led to believe that there was going to be partisan discussion about health care. And they just said, we've been totally shut out of the discussion. In the House, we won't have any say with what's going to happen. So I don't say that it's all on the Republican side, that there has to be somewhere walking across the street.
Well, yeah, but here's a good story. In September, when the press asked the president, he was doing a press conference about health care, and one of the reporters said, well, Mr. President said you're going to be bipartisan. You haven't met with a Republican leader in health care since May. That's 4 or 5 months. So where's your bipartisanship, Mr. President? They're not they're not at the table. Look,
but certainly there was extended conversation summer, right?
It's not on the level, though. If you take the Senate Finance Committee, where the whole process waited, part of the pain of this loss in support for the president over health care was a decision to let the Finance Committee lead. This was bipartisan, Democrats, Republicans, sitting at the table. The bill that ultimately emerged had no public option, had no tax increases, it was individual, no employer mandate. Okay? And the only vote was Olympia Snowe. It's not on the level. It doesn't matter how moderate the bill is. Now, I don't blame Republicans. They are in this context, they want him to fail. They're just doing a terrible job of showing it.
Although there was, just to maybe before you go to the next question, amplify, maybe you can respond to this. I mean, while Chuck Grassley was negotiating this summer, all summer with Max Baucus, and while he was doing so, conservatives in Iowa publicly suggesting there would be a primary challenge against him if he went too far in making a deal. At the same time, Tom Harkin, the other Democratic senator from Iowa, took that occasion to tell one of the Capitol Hill newspapers that maybe we should start voting every 2 years on whether chairmen keep their gavels, which seemed to be a signal to Baucus not to go too far in making a deal. When you look at this, someone said before, Mark, I think you said there's a mechanism here that kind of pushes. I saw the other day that liberal groups announced they've raised $3.5 million for primary challenges against any Democrat who opposes the health care bill. So, I mean, is this a question of just individual leaders, or is there now kind of a structural force that prevents the kinds of thing that Baucus and Grassley seem to initially want to do?
It's hard, but let's note, the committee did pass that bill. And the president.
Ron, you alluded to something earlier that I think really rings true. Anytime a Republican tries to be bipartisan, he gets crushed the next day by Sean, Rush, Beck, O'Reilly, and they automatically start rallying a candidate to run against him. I mean, it's just a structural impediment to bipartisanship.
Mark, what do you think? I mean, how much would a Republican have to fear in this climate of being seen as going too far to help Obama? Certainly Charlie Crist is getting hammered for supporting the stimulus plan.
Well, I welcome my brother's comments on this, but we're going through the sort of struggle the Democratic Party did 10 years ago about what is the direction. I think it's a healthy debate. I think it's one in which people with the biggest microphones right now happen to represent a particular faction of the Republican Party, but that's why I see it as a missionary job on my part to go out on sometimes to reflect, a different sort of progressive Republican sentiment on a number of issues, to suggest that it is a big tent, that there are room for alternative voices, and like I said, the people with big microphones have to be reflected. But I think it's actually healthy ultimately for the party, and I think we did see significant evidence last Tuesday that people who did both things. I mean, they clung to core Republican principles, but they also ran on local centrist issues, and weren't talking about sort of ideological social issues.
But you're right, the Democrats did go through it 10 years ago, but what we decided was it was okay to have a Charlie Melanson from Louisiana who was pro-life, pro-gun, and he could vote the way he wanted to and still be a Democrat. And so we have.
Although, John, Move On today is running ads attacking Democrats from difficult districts who voted against.
So he could be a Republican, but he could still be a Democrat.
No, that's not right. No, because he's still on economic policies. Down the line is a good populist Democrat. My point is that we built a majority with people like Travis Childers from Mississippi and Heath Shuler from North Carolina, as well as people out west and northeast. And you showed on Tuesday that you're not willing to do that, because the second you have a moderate Republican like Dede Scozafaza, you're going to blow her up. And so you're basically saying, as David Plouffe said, do not apply. No need to apply. And right now, if you have moderate Republicans, you're eating your young, and you're never going to get to a majority by doing that.
A quick answer, Bill.
I'm sorry. I have to talk.
Yeah, go ahead, quick.
The Democrats did that to get the majority, but given what's going to happen on the abortion vote in their caucus about that abortion vote, what happened was they tolerated these Democrats because they needed them. Now there's going to, and what I'm saying is
not tolerated. They voted against the health care bill without retribution.
Without retribution. Right. Look at their committee assignments. Look where the money's coming from. What I'm saying is that I do not believe the pro-life Democrats and this number pro-life, pro-gun Democrats are going to survive long in this majority.
They may not, Bill. But the reality of it is Nancy Pelosi, when Bobby Bright from Montgomery, Alabama, came up there, she said, take care of yourself to get reelected. And that is what he's doing.
But why have a party? Why have a party if it doesn't have an organizing idea? The opposite of a Democrat in the United States, the reason there's a fight is the opposite of a Democrat is actually a conservative, not a Republican. There is an organizing idea. You can't be you can't be a Republican if you don't oppose those things, the big spending, the expansion of government.
Thinking that.
Here's what I would say, though, in an effort to appeal to bipartisanship. Excuse me a moment. What I would say is look at Virginia. Bob McDonnell, hugely conservative fellow, reached across the middle, not by moderating his principles, just the opposite, but by explaining how his principles were not only good for saying no. He's explained that, look, I want to spend more to grow the economy. I just want you to do it, not Washington. I want better schools. I want you to have the choices, not Washington. So guess what? There is a positive Republican agenda out there. You may not know it. I think you're going to see more of it in 2010.
Hold on. Let's go back to the audience over here.
Hi. Hi. Okay. When I first opted to propose the question, I thought it was going to be slightly more off base than it's gotten to be. But I wanted to bring up the idea. I mean, I came down here from Boston, where Republican was basically a dirty word, not because of the belief system, but because of the reputation. And so my question, I suppose, is how much of the voters' opinion do you think is laced in the word, Republican or Democrat, and how much is laced in the ideology, and what effect that's going to have in 2010 now over the last year, and how much that's changed?
Good question.
Well, that's a great question. I'll jump in, but there's interesting attachments to both to the word Republican as there is to the word liberal. Both have baggage right now, but the Republican Party, but by a majority of 2-to-1, people consider themselves conservative over liberal. So part of the Republican job in the next cycle is going to be to reattach conservative to the brand of Democrat. But you don't mean Republican. I just said to Republican. So,
Larry.
I think there's sort of simplicity to this. What are the core beliefs argument? And Alex is so persuasive, I almost fell for it. But what it is, there's dimensions
part of the parlor
to this.
trick.
There is a kind of social dimension, like John was talking about, where people that encompasses things like abortion and guns and those kinds of values. And then there's economic beliefs, and then there's foreign policy and national security. And what makes this complicated is that they're not that those things don't have to be connected in an ideological framework. So you're not without core beliefs if you're socially conservative and have a more liberal economic point of view. You're not without core beliefs if you're Scoop Jackson and you have you're a hawk on foreign policy and you're and you're an economic liberal. And so the problems that I think you run into in parties is when you have this sort of sense of ideological purity that keeps people from getting ahead. If they don't fall into line on every single issue, number one, you do have trouble winning elections, and number two, you have a hell of a hard time getting anything done once you get there, because you do end up with basically the most ideologically hidebound group of your party who can actually make it through that vetting process. And that's the issue.
We've overstayed our welcome already, but I want to squeeze in one question from the audience and then ask one question of my own to the panel. So over here for a quick question, please.
Y'all have said that 2/3 of Americans say they're conservative, but only 20% identify as Republicans. I mean, do you feel like you're doing something wrong, like by identifying Republican with conservative? And how can you change that to keep people from feeling isolated? Because personally, in the last election, I did feel isolated, being socially liberal and fiscally conservative.
I think the actual numbers were 40%.
40% are self-identified conservatives and 20%, self-identified, liberals. But this issue is a big deal because the assumption is that conservative and Republican go together. It's not. It is true that those people who say both of those things, unfortunately, is 2/3 of the party of a party that's increasingly out of touch. But most Democrats describe themselves as either moderate or conservative. And it's part of a transformation Democrats went through in addressing the kind of issues you talked about, starting under Bill Clinton. New Democrats who were indeed fiscally conservative dealt with balanced budget, dealt with tax issues, dealt with the issues that crime and other things national security issues. Democrats had not done well.
All those things happened after the Republican majorities.
But it's now part of the Democratic Party. Fiscal austerity, until this year, until the last few months, Democrats were trusted on handling the budget deficits, handling the budget spending deficits by a lot, given the history of President Clinton and given the history of
let me
and could you fill in the blank to what happened to that in
you
3
have
months?
fixed that, though.
Yeah. Let me ask a final question before we go, because we're running out of time, and maybe start with Alex, Larry, and then kind of go in that way. It is possible that in the next few months we will pass the biggest addition to the American social safety net since Medicare, if not since Social Security, with a health care bill. And that we will do it virtually, if not entirely, on a party line basis, which is almost unprecedented. Even Medicare and Social Security, although Republicans most voted to recommit, on final passage there were substantial Republican votes for both. This could happen one party, virtually alone, instituting a major expansion of the safety net. If health care reform does pass in something like the form that it now exists, and the details may alter, obviously, between now and then, do you believe Republican candidates in 2010, and particularly the Republican presidential candidate in 2012, will run on repealing the health care reform? And if they do, the question for the Democrats, what would be the implications of that? Alex, do you think they will?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think they will run on repealing a bunch of it and reforming the rest, yes. Those things you mentioned, Medicare and Social Security, have current unfunded obligations of $100 trillion, which makes the $10 trillion debt we have looks like small potatoes. And I think so now we're modeling our future after that. And the spending, I think, is going to scare folks to death. I think that's built into the stock price now. I think people have already seen the health care and spending story. They're not going to see any effects really immediately on their health care before the next elections, 2010, probably even before 2012. Certainly not enough to change the political equation. The votes Democrats are going to pick up by extending health care to people who don't have it, those are Democratic votes now. The votes they're going to lose are people who are happy with their health care, are going to see the cost actually go up the next year or so. So, yes, I think there's going to be a reform this. Let's start over. Let's do a more thoughtful, incremental approach that will really control costs first.
Well, I think at one level I agree, which is I don't think that this is like the end-all and be-all of healthcare, and we're never going to have a healthcare policy debate or discussion again in this country. I think people are going to look at whatever has happened and however it comes out of Congress and God willing passes and gets signed. I think that ultimately there's going to be things that have to be changed over time. And this is, we've reformed Medicare and Social Security, and so there's going to be improvements down the road. So I agree with Alex on this. Do I think anybody's going to come out in an aggressive manner, campaign to repeal it? No, I think what Mark said earlier is true. It's certainly by 2010 you're not going to see this thing having sort of taken hold or specific changes that have come about because of it. It just takes too long to get it going. By 2012, I do think people are going to see changes and positive changes. But in the long run, I don't think Alex points out that there's these unfunded obligations on Social Security and Medicare. They're daunting, they're huge, but I don't hear anybody saying we got to go out and repeal them. And just one last point, if I can. Nobody is ever going to say we need to go back to the good old days when people were denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions. Nobody's ever going to say, God, can't we get back to where we have annual caps on the coverage we got no matter how sick we were? I mean, there are things that are fundamentally and radically going to change for the better in everybody's health care that people are going to be very reluctant to turn back to the days that the good old days that everybody voted against.
Bill, you probably poll more on health care than anybody. What do you think? In 2012, will the Republican nominee run on fundamentally repealing it if it goes into law?
What I think is going to happen. Here's what I think is going to happen. I don't accept that premise, Ron. I think what's going to happen is, one, I'm still not sure it's going to pass, and if it does pass, I think it could be a way scaled back bill or on a couple critical elements than what we saw in the House. And two, I think the president's going to lose a boatload of seats in 2010, and like most presidents, he's going to wake up and say, gee, what do I have to fix before I get reelected? And he will do two things. He will go back and they will re-enter and they will, quote, fix health care in 2011, and there's going to be an entitlement commission, and they will try to fix long-term spending because he cannot run for re-election after what's going to happen in 2010 without, quote, fixing those issues. And so I don't think we get to 2012. I think there's congressional action because the Democrats will want to readjust what they've done on those two issues in 2011.
And so in 2010, will the Republican candidates, implied in that, is the Republican candidates in 2010 will run on significantly retrenching or undoing what was done?
I think, yeah, I'm saying overall, given what we're seeing, I think, look, first off, there could be a huge international event. Afghanistan could go horribly. I mean, we know, and what I'm saying first, I just want to say, as I always do, some weird thing could happen way beyond our pay grade that could affect the election. So, but if it does not, if we continue in this trajectory, they lose a boatload of seats, and then the president says, oops, I've got to go fix this. And then
I think it's good on this because when the last largest social program was implemented by Republicans, the Medicare Part D for seniors, which was, we ran, Democrats were against it, and that thing did not get implemented until after the next elections. It had a net opposition when it was voted on. Within a year later, and it still had not been implemented, it had a net favorable. Okay? You got to remember, hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent right now demonizing the health care bill. We will get a bump on that. I mean, there will be a bump. And, we did not win one damn seat in 2006, I think it was, beating the heck out of Republicans for what they did to make Medicare Part B a big program. We just didn't. And you're not going to get any, not as big a gains as you think on trying to beat us up for health care.
Stan.
First of all, I accept the question because you asked it, and
there you go.
In the end, it is very dangerous to create a framework for the election of going back, which is, if you're talking about Republicans making this, should we go back to the old health care system? They created a framework for the 2010 election, which would intensify Democratic base and creates a choice which favors Democrats. The fact is, it's not going to be the issue. The economy is going to. I mean,
no, I'm not saying it's going to be the issue. I'm just asking what they're going to do.
If we lose a boatload of seats, it's because the economy didn't come back. It's not because of health care. It's the economy is the central issue. It will be the driver, of this thing. By the way, had they not done GM and Chrysler, and unemployment were now 10.5 or 11%, and GM and Chrysler are going out of business, we'd be, dealing with a, different set of issues. But in the end, it's going to be our jobs being created, is unemployment coming down, people have any confidence in that future. That's what will
setting aside its centrality, the degree to which it's central. Do you expect the Republican presidential nominee in 2012 to seek to repeal it? No. You think they'll have to accept it by then?
They'll do it in the primaries, and they will not run on it in the general.
Rick Santorum will.
There's 80% popularity on the Massachusetts
seek to repeal it in 2012?
No, I don't think so. And I've had the unusual, weird political history of having worked with both Stan and Bill, and I think they're both the smartest political pollsters in their respective parties.
They're both right.
And they're both right. And
which is a problem because I've worked with you too, and you didn't mention me. Yeah. But that's all right. Don't worry about it.
I wrote that down.
But an outcome of the discussion we had earlier that Bill touched on, which I think would be really smart, is that President Obama has had to do huge, big things, which has created a huge anxiety across the country, which was reflected in the last election. There's just enormous economic anxiety with all the programs, with all the auto bailout, the bank bailout, the stimulus program, what have you. Now, arguably, those are things that he had to do, and perhaps a Republican president would have done many of the same things. Nevertheless, there is that anxiety. I think politically, the smartest thing for the president and his administration to do would be, after having passed health care, would be to do, as was generally described here, which is to make whatever fixes you need to in that bill, but also have some kind of big omnibus entitlement spending, a deficit plan that addresses this anxiety about big government, because that is a huge thing that will only be exacerbated in the short term by the health care bill.
All right. Well, you have had the privilege of hearing some of the smartest minds in American politics wrestle with some of the toughest issues on the table. So join me in thanking our panel for a great presentation. And thank you for sitting it out all afternoon. Walter, who's Jason? I think Jason.